And now, without further ado, today's program will be in two parts. The first part is featuring Elisabeth Condon, who will be sharing a slide presentation of her work and her practice. And then for the second portion of today's presentation, she'll be joined in conversation by Ola Wlusek. So, Elisabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. I'm going to take you through work since about 2003 when I came to Tampa to teach at the University of South Florida, and from there, talk with Ola. So I wanted to show you some primary influences behind my work before showing you the work itself. And the biggest influence on my experience is my childhood neighborhood in Los Angeles, where this fence marked the barrier between suburban life and the wild canyon beyond. And inside the house, my mother's decor, over the top, a wallpaper where she merged two patterns and on which to hang pictures of her family. Note the kidney desk. Television. In my childhood, the Flintstones was a great source of delight, a Hanna-Barbera production, but just beautiful details like the white wheels echoing the mailbox, and then the white extending up into the tattered covering of the foot-driven car. I just loved the big shapes and stylization of this cartoon. Likewise, the fanciful castaways on the desert island of Gilligan's Island. And something about this, I would watch this in the afternoons, and the professor on the lower left, his daughter went to my school. So far before the age of Instagram, I would see him picking up his daughter, and then I'd go home and watch him on TV. So there was always this dual kind of virtual and reality aspect to life, even then, in LA. In the 1970s, the music industry took off and bands were touring all around, and they loved coming to Los Angeles. And this was the magazine that young girls like myself read to be part of the music scene. And something about club culture that really influenced me as an artist was, the adorning of one's self, the embellishment of one's identity as a creative act. And later, this is from a book my mother had, The Decorating Fiend, on Irving Penn's flowers. And I love the kind of tattered yet gorgeous glamour of these fading flowers. And that becomes very important later on. And landscape is a huge influence. This is the view out my studio in New York on the Lower East Side facing the East River, behind those sunlit buildings on the right. And then we start really with my arrival in Tampa in 2003 to teach at University of South Florida. This is our house in North Tampa, and it was 15 years between the time I left Los Angeles and came to Tampa. And in that time, I lived in Chicago and New York. So it had been a long time since I'd been in a sun-saturated environment. And it overtook me with such power to be both an adult and a child at the same time, because Tampa in the early aughts, was very much like 1960s LA in my imagination. So it was as if I were both an adult and a child. And I sought a language to express this duality that I was experiencing in Florida. And I couldn't just paint it because it wasn't literal. So what language could I use as a model to express this overlay? And it was in Chinese scroll paintings, specifically Yuan Dynasty, And this is Wang Meng, one of the four masters of the Yuan dynasty. He was the least popular because when the Mongols invaded China, he went to work for them instead of retreating to the mountains. But as you can see from this image, he certainly still dreamed about it with the scholars' houses nestled in the mountains. And something that interested me about Chinese painting was that it was built from swappable parts. So in this bamboo stalk, which itself is divided into 4 vertical strokes that open and close with each gesture, and then the stalks grow out from the side, and then the leaves, which are considered the adornment and the compositional finish, are clusters of goldfish and fish strokes, like fishtail strokes, that are turning in space to articulate the volume. So this was really exciting to me because you can learn a stroke order and then use it again and again and turn it in space. It just seemed so great. And also the reduction of color to the color of ink was a way to talk about climate and temperature in a way that I'd never considered before. And thirdly, it was water-based, which I love water-based media. So I started working with Chinese painting, from Chinese painting, but in a kind of idealized way. This is a painting from 2007, and it's a balance between Florida and New York. This was a big issue for me as I had moved from New York to Tampa, but I still had a place in New York, and I was like, can I use the oppositions, the embrace of oppositions in Chinese painting to try to work out my situation? This is Bent Tree 2007, and it's, I think, 56 by 53 inches, so easel-sized painting. Something that's happening in here besides the balance of opposites that was a principle of Chinese composition that I grafted onto the imagery in this painting was that I was starting to use acrylic paint, which I'd always eschewed, in tandem with oil. But by 2010, with this painting, Field Notes, which is 48 inches high, comprised of 8 panels and 312 inches long, I was already painting in full acrylic. So the transition to acrylic that happened in Florida was profoundly impacted by Chinese painting and the humidity of Florida itself, as Paul Jenkins so rightly points out in his diary. I went to China in 2009. I had a solo exhibition at a gallery called The Big Wind, Da Fang, in Dashanzi 798, which was the epicenter of the Chinese art world at the time. I was so excited. And the gallery rented a studio for me that was so huge, like double the size of this room, it felt like. So it really upped my scale. This is Sunset Holocaust. It's 79 by 110 inches long, the same length of the paintings that are at Ringling. And the size of the painting, the access to materials, really drove me to more deeply ingest the ethos of ink painting. And in this same-sized painting, also made in China, you can see multiple viewpoints of Beijing, which is where I was, to depict like a portrait of the city. Back in the United States, this was a portrait, a landscape, I should say, of upstate New York in the fall, and going with the logic of Chinese painting where you're balancing opposites, but you're integrating them within the composition. It's never an opposition. It's a balancing of unlike elements. I would insert into the color range of my environment a kind of area to walk around in, so that it was like a scroll, always moving. But unlike a scroll, it was compressed into the space of a canvas format. Piling time onto itself so it became simultaneous, which felt much more like the time we live in than scroll painting where you have tea and unfurl the scroll over time. Also painted at Yaddo, the first harbinger of pattern, starting to define space. I was not aware of this really. It was just a way to echo elements in the landscape and move from one point to the next, but it really seems like a harbinger. This is called Autumn Trees Yaddo. And woke up to find it missing, 72 by 50, 57 by 72. And just like almost translating landscape into a set of beats in a way, and rhythms and patterns taken from Raggedy Ann's, the stuffed doll, her striped legs. And then moving towards, this is, just to give you a time frame, this is about 2012. This painting is 86 by 90, and it's called White Lines, and it's about nightclubs. And I was working in the composition, the lower right, Los Angeles in a reduced language. The pores, there's glitter, but in the middle of the painting, the focal point of the sunset with a brick road leading to it is from a 1974 Elton John album cover. So just quoting from those early sources and really mining that period of time as material for my work. In this painting, you have the pattern of mylar on the right, glitter, and also a boa stuck on there and gemstones. So I was just like getting into a kind of weird bas-relief with sentimental materials. In 2014, I went to China to the Swatch Art Peace Hotel, a 6-month residency. So it's considered a legal move, which is interesting. And this was my view. I lived on the Puxing side of the city. You see before you the Huangpu River, and then the dazzling sight of the Pudong New Business Area. This was right after I think one of the buildings is still being built, but that's what it looks like, and that is a very reduced version of how it feels. So I didn't know how to make sense of it. So I started drawing the buildings, and I hadn't drawn. I'd projected imagery I'd pour paint, project imagery inside the pour to cut through it. And so everything had a similar level of ease. But in drawing the images, I had to kind of go back and carve out a different kind of space within the pours. This is like Shanghai is a big lily pad with buildings. And then a smaller portrait, 59 by 59 inches of summertime, which was oppressively hot. And just layering on a glitter sky. And this is of the boat. This, by the way, is 79 by 98 inches, so it's a pretty big painting. But talking about the boats on the Huangpu River, which were so illuminated, and you could go have drinks on them, and they'd have videos all over them. The buildings would have LED lights running down and then video monitors placed on them with a whole other set of information. So it was a really intense technological and very artificial environment, which I found completely exciting and thrilling, and was like, how do I paint it? And so this was my studio in Shanghai during our open studio. So a lot of glitter and, pours to express the kind of otherwise unfathomable amount of visual information in the place. These are the same paintings in New York for the 2015 New York Pulse Art Fair, which this booth won first prize, so that was exciting. I'm showing you this to show you the wallpaper that I designed from tracings that I made in Shanghai of planters filled with cardboard, or stacks of cardboard on bikes, the way people really got around. And I forgot to tell you that in Beijing, those 79 by 110 inch paintings were delivered on bicycle. So pretty ingenious use of two wheels basically everywhere in the country. Just showing the painting on the wallpaper was so exciting, and started to suggest my mother's decor. as a source of not like something cheesy that I had to get away from, but something that I could turn into as an extension of scroll painting. She started giving me her samples, and I love the idea of making a world from a little sample of a piece of fabric and kind of using that piece of fabric as a launch through which to expand. So these paintings are 72 by 57. I really love that size. And they're extensions of her wallpaper. And this is a flag painting from 2016. And so this wallpaper idea, I designed this wallpaper for Wave Hill in Riverdale, New York. I worked in this room as on residency there, and then showed this work, once the residency completed. And so just the correspondence between the pattern in the ink drawing on the left and the wallpaper, and then how they harmonize with the flower on the right. And here's the flower painting to give you a sense of scale. And this idea of an artificial landscape, both ruinous and glamorous, really, I stayed with it. And I started working in this long, almost scroll-like format, 47 by 151 inches. We're still in 2016. Layering different wallpapers together, my mother's and some other ones as well that I just chose for their glamour. And, working with glitter and pores and pouring calligraphy ink into the pores to sully them, layering them with a level of soot as the ink comes from trees, so quite literally. And just to show you in context how these were shown as almost like wallpaper samples, or, this is commonplace, but it was very exciting in 2017. And Tsunami Plants, a painting about summer in New York, with the weeds insisting on their way through the cracks of the sidewalk. And landscapes incorporating, this is 48 inches square, incorporating wallpaper, like literal references from wallpaper Chinese painting, and those things. So in 2018, 2019, I started studying Chinese painting in a really serious way. Theretofore, I had taken different classes with people in Taiwan, Mr. Ho, who would always say, could improve, and then his wife would say, this is very beautiful, and it was always his. So I thought I'd get serious, and I started taking classes at the China Institute, and I worked with a woman, Sung Suk Seton, who I just loved, and she turned me on to Wu Guangdong, who painted this beautiful painting, and I was just very taken. Like, it was the first time after Huang Gong Wang's Dwelling in the Fuchun Mountains when I first discovered Chinese painting that I just vibrated through my body with the resonance about how he painted landscape. So this is me trying to copy him, but it was a very interesting experience, and towards the end of it, I almost didn't paint at all. I just did ink painting every day. I taught it. I took classes in it. I was immersed in it. And at the end of it, I had a residency at Graphic Studio in 2019. And in the process of creating a print, this print to be precise, I was making these mock-ups. These are cutouts from different trials that we did. And then I created a mock-up of it. And it was like this little world. And I'm still really excited about this. I haven't maximized its opportunities as much as I want to. But at Graphic Studio, these layers ended up in this print, Tempest. I think it's 29 by 41 inches. It's pretty big. And it's a very compressed space, so taking scroll space even further. But it really comes from after a year of scroll painting. It was also very times in New York, like, were getting kind of tough. And so it was pigeons were my metaphor for us wandering this kind of disastrous landscape. So in color reduction, like I wanted the dark and the light to be together in the print. And it was shown in an exhibition designed by Ola Wlusek. The world is just so small now in 2022 during pandemic. That same year, this is an exhibition in Miami at Emerson Dorsch Gallery, and the exhibition had two parts, but I'm showing you this first part because of the props that I had fabricated to go with the painting in the back, so that when you looked at that painting, you would be moving through literal components from that painting, and it would extend the pictorial space of the painting out into our world in the gallery. And then when we redid the show, we removed the two big paintings, and we had facing the back painting, the photograph of the setup that I showed you before. And this to me was like walking inside of an ink painting, and it thrills me even now to look at it. Because it was just so coherent with what I'd been doing that whole year, but it was different. But in that show, there were also other paintings, and these are just ways that I'm adapting the techniques of Chinese painting into works on canvas or linen, carving into the paint with a palette knife, loading up two colors in a brush and slathering on the paint really thickly, balancing these with pores, and so on. Also, the element of Chinese painting where you memorize stroke order to the point where it becomes percussive because your body's ingested each gesture so often that it doesn't even matter what you do. You can just do the whole combination of things like dancing or, percussion and just go crazy. And that's what this painting represents. These are easel-sized paintings. I can't remember the exact dimensions. Somewhere in the 54-inch range and smaller, something like that. And a beautiful pour with, you can see the calligraphy ink in the flower, and then the lattice drawing round. So brushwork and pouring, offsetting each other. And that moves into pouring as a form of drawing. These are 30 by 21 inches. And just taking you through really quickly. So more directed pours, very specific, but not, like a flower. I'm going to make a flower. I'm going to counterpoint it with a brick wall. I'm going to counterpoint the pour with, a few dots. And then the pandemic hit. And I'm showing you two paintings from the pandemic. These are lattice paintings. I stopped painting flowers. It was automatic, and started painting lattice as a way to investigate models and structures and their pliability. And it was all I wanted to do, and it was all I did. I made like 200 lattice works on paper. I just became obsessed with lattice. And then the pandemic was over, and the flowers came back instantly. Here's a flower as a character, a kind of sad sack with a supporting chorus on the bottom. I thought the sky was a building, but I was looking for a language. This is an image for scale, showing you that I work on paper scrolls too, but I'm not showing you that today in the interest of time. And also the pouring as a way of drawing created troughs. The paint was so thick it would literally create like a trough in the middle where I could put other color. And also post-pandemic, you see the lattice opening up to spaces beneath that are sometimes glitter encrusted. So there's layers on there, and I'm making that known by ripping the top surface off. But I was looking for a way to paint the flowers. I was looking for something, and this started to get to it. These really random, hideous pours. Just to tell you about acrylic, when you make an acrylic pour, the image is so saturated, you don't really know what you're going to get. It's like the pour is there, your whole painting is like a lake, and you just have to wait for it to dry. But then the water will evaporate, and then you get a really thin surface, and you're like, wait, I thought that was out of control, and it's not. This painting was kind of like that, but it's a little painting, 27 by 23. But that pour is so ugly. And so it took quite a long time to navigate. Like, how am I going to get a painting out of this? I super love it because I did. Here's a 72-inch square painting, and this is something that's starting to happen where pattern starts to become, as it has been before, but it's not in the background this time. It's structural to the form of the flower itself. I believe this is Dateline from 2022, and the thin stem is an outcome of the pores sometimes leaking off the edge of the canvas, and that is something that I play with a lot as a teetering structure. So a world on a stem. And then we come to the ringling works that you can see in the galleries. And this is Florida's heat dome from last summer. I'm the language of painting the plant forms and flowers is becoming very thick and heavy pours that are almost bas relief, and then more illustrative drawing, which I've always done as well since the time in Shanghai. So I'm showing you these because you can go see them live. But this is a proper Chinese painting, and then I edit around the sides of the form itself to create layers that I'm working through. And here's this one. I had to let go of my ideas of making a flower that would integrate and accept that interplanetary life was possible within the center of a flower. And the scale of this really excited me. And the drawing, and all the drawing is in the pores themselves, like layering the paint information and then just letting it be, like not closing it, but keeping it open. Bullseye. These are 68 by 110. And then a little nocturne. This started out as a lattice painting in the pandemic, and then it took 2 years to kind of figure it out. And it became this little forest, 30 by 21 inches. Installation view of one of the most gorgeous installations I've ever seen in my life of my work. Thank you, Ringling Museum curators. Hello. Just to show you these the heavy pores that they're becoming forms, and it's polymer, which is a non-toxic plastic, and this is from the CAM Skyway's exhibition, and it's about 5 feet by 22 feet. And so this just, the heavy pores that you saw in some of the paintings are becoming their own forms. And this is the surface of those pores. So this is a new part of my work that's developing. And it's a way to integrate landscape directly into my work as I go out and collect things on walking. I take walks every day, and I collect things on my walks, put them in my pockets, and then put them into these polymer pores. So it's like a random composition, and I have to use the elements to compose to keep things interesting and new, so that I don't get complacent in my compositional decisions. And this is another one, Noel. This is really crazy. It's a New Orleans. It's a New Orleans landscape, and there's my mom's wedding photo in it. I don't think she might appreciate it. And then closing with the molten flower of Irving Penn. It accompanies the large-scale pours at USF CAM Skyways. And this is 72 by 57. So I just want to extend my deepest thanks to everyone at Ringling for such a beautiful job, and adding Jay, who is calibrating the sound, and to you too, who I haven't met yet. Thank you.
All right, everyone. As we turn the lights back up, Ola and Elisabeth will be making their way up to the stage. I just want to say, Elisabeth, thank you so much for bringing us into your world through your painting and your practice and your travels throughout the world. That was an amazing talk, and I cannot wait to hear what comes next. So for this next segment, everyone, Ola is going to be joining Elisabeth in conversation, and following this segment, we'll have some time for audience questions as well. So if you have questions, feel free to jot them down. All right, Ola and Elisabeth.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today, friends. I hope everyone's comfy, and I see that you have your coffee and refreshments. Again, thank you so much for being here. I'm one of the co-curators of this iteration of Skyway 2024, a contemporary collaboration, along with Christopher Jones, the curator, Stanton B. and Nancy W. Kaplan, curator of photography and media. And I want to acknowledge Chris, who's in the audience today as well, along with all the other co-curators that worked on Skyway too. I also wanted to take a moment to thank Katie Nickel for this very thorough introduction of Elisabeth and myself, as well as for preparing this talk today. Thank you to the events team and everyone else who's making talks like this possible. But of course, I wanted to welcome Elisabeth. Thank you so much for this incredible, generous presentation and a deeper look into your work. I really appreciate you being with us today. Elisabeth is one of those artists that, well, the question that we often get as Skyway co-curators, as there's now, I believe, 6 of us, with each iteration, this is the 3rd iteration of Skyway. With each iteration, we seem to be adding more spaces, more venues, and more curators. And the question that we often as curators receive is, how do you agree upon which artists will be showing where? How does that happen? Do you argue and fight? Well, in the case of Elisabeth, we did, so much so that she is the only artist, I believe, in this 3rd iteration that is shown in 2 spaces. So Chris and I curated Elisabeth here and are showing more of her 2-dimensional canvas, beautiful canvas work, whereas Christos Viveras-Fone, our co-curator, friend, and colleague over at USF Contemporary Art Museum, is showing the more 3-dimensional work. But anyway, that's a little bit of a digression, but also an acknowledgement of how all of us, how honored and excited we were to show your pieces. So again, thank you. I guess I wanted to kick off this conversation a little bit about going back to kind of the beginning of your presentation and the information that you shared with us about some of your early experiences in LA and Florida. You know, I think of those 2 very opposite cities on either coast as kind of very different in terms of vibe and mood. As far as LA is concerned, like the glitz and the bling. And of course, Florida maybe has a little bit of a slower reputation, maybe, but perhaps not with Disney World or Disneyland. But anyway, but also I'm thinking about the commonalities too of the brightness, the sun, the atmosphere. Going back to your childhood, you know, it's maybe a little bit of a sort of a cliche question, but I'm genuinely curious to know what were some of your early experiences? Like, how did you know that you wanted to be an artist? When did that begin? And I'm mentioning that because your work is very much so rooted in memory and observation, like this keen observation about your environment, right? There's this nostalgic element to it. So that just tells me that you perhaps were a child or a youth that was paying close attention to things and remembering things. So how did you know this is pursuit that you're going to take on, this artistic journey?
So I'm trying to get back to that first image of the fence, but you guys, I can't do it. I think that I always did feel that I wanted to be an artist. Maybe I remember my first memories were of walking down the street, the suburban street towards the canyon, but sometimes there was a big tree and a rise in the hill, and I could go underneath that tree and be ensconced in its canopy, and the sun would beat down and there were hills behind me. That was a very early memory and just exciting. Like, landscape offered all this adventure, but it was silent. Like, it wasn't another person. It was a protagonist. So that's something that I think grounds my interest in landscape. But so my first memories are the sun beating down, being in the canyon, the magic of that. And I think I looked at Degas. Reproductions and felt this yearning. Like, how could a human being make those tutus? And that, I don't know how old I was, but I really wanted to know that. And I took art. I think the most seminal experience was art classes with Renata Zerner, who had an apartment in Westwood Village, which was super cool at the time. And she would play Judy Collins' Send in the Clowns, all this nostalgia. And I was 10, and my mom would take me once a week. And she was a really great art teacher. And we would set up huge pieces of, like, wrapping paper, and I would do big scale drawings. I think that's where my scale comes from. And she also had me drop watercolor onto paper. And she actually showed one in an art show, and somebody wanted to buy it, and my parents said no. So that's a really early experience.
Thank you for sharing that. Speaking of land or the geography of it, your experiences from China, New York, travels to Mexico, and now, of course, being based in Florida, result in almost sort of an intermix or overlay of imagery in your work. Kind of is all encompassing in some way between all those places that you've visited. So obviously you are an artist that's very much informed by the locale where you are, but also not only the natural but the man-made environment. I'm wondering about what is your process for studying a landscape? What does that process look like? You've mentioned you take daily sort of ritualistic walks, but do you sketch? Do you take photographs? Obviously, your memory is really good, but I'm eager to know, what does that process look like? How do you arrive at your paintings? And just if you could speak more about the geology of a place and the important role it plays in your work.
So each place is different, and I travel a lot. Like this year, I've been to residencies in New Orleans, North Carolina. I was just on a residency in Long Island, and I went to Colorado for a week also, kind of a residency. And I didn't paint all those places, but in New Orleans I was there for 6 weeks. And so that's a good place. Well, I mean, so the walks are a way to just see the place. What does it look like? What are the houses like? What kind of neighborhood am I in? Am I in a neighborhood or am I downtown? What is it? And then there's what kind of like with New Orleans, it's below sea level. We were on a prominent rise in the residency, so you wouldn't know that where we were. It took a couple weeks to see where the levee was and the kind of way space drops off after that levee. It's like the end of the world. It's so cool. Anyway, and that's something I haven't even painted yet, but to try to stay focused on your question. I mean, every place has color and space that is unique to it. And so it's to get the feeling of that the walks are, it's recognizance. It's just a way to know the terrain. But then sketchbooks and sketches of places, sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. In New Orleans, I did not, because I was working with textiles in a very conscious way, so it was more compositional there. But sometimes I do draw from the landscape. Like in Shanghai, for example, I had an oversized big sketchbook, and I would spend, like, sometimes I didn't feel like painting at all. And I had that studio. It was like we were living in a hotel. And sometimes I just wanted to look out the window and look at the Pudong new business area and just get a feeling for what was going on. So I would draw it, and I would draw it for hours. It took a long time to draw, maybe 2 hours, and do a really blow-by-blow, paced-out sketch. With brush pens. I mean, we have to have fun, but I mean, because pencils are dry and brush pens are wet. But, and I'd pace it out. And it's almost as if to draw literally from the landscape is a way of ingesting it in your body. It's a form of digestion of location. And then from there, once I've digested it, then it's in me. And then I can reinvent it. Reconstruct it, construct the landscape. So that's how it works.
The construction of the landscape, the different motifs that are prevalent in your work. And I do want to reference, and maybe we don't need to look for it, but the one work that's at the Ringling, Summer Afternoon, it features something that really stood out to me, which is the bird of paradise plant. Interestingly enough, when I do take my evening walks in downtown Sarasota, it's a plant that I find, growing by the sidewalk. Being from Canada, it's a very expensive plant that's not seen up there anywhere. So it now became this motif that I very much so find familiar and identify as part of Floridiana because it's in Sarasota. It's so easily I'm very easily able to find it. So I wanted to ask you about the symbolic elements within your landscape and how do they hold meaning within the work on Florida. How important it is for you to have the viewers to be able to use them to situate themselves geographically within the narrative of your work.
Yeah, this varies, but Florida is a root motif. I live here, I paint here, and I painted this during the heat dome. The bird of paradise, just to trace one symbol, if you will. In Los Angeles, my grandparents lived in Bel Air on a hill, not the Bel Air that you see in movies, but like Bel Air that was possible for them to have. And they lived at the top of a high hill, which, I mean, now it's a really fancy neighborhood, but at the time it wasn't as much. And they had a backyard that was kind of round, and it overlooked the city. You could see from Palos Verdes Peninsula, from any of you guys who know LA, all the way up the Pacific coast to Santa Barbara. I mean, it was incredible. And it was this tiered, almost like a rice paddy, like this tiered hillside. And now what you see from the house would be the Getty and all the construction that's happening around the Getty Museum. But at the time, it was pure wilderness with this opulent view. And he grew birds of paradise. So it was part of that backyard. And that backyard is like, that is just the core. And then I went to Chicago for grad school, and then I went to New York to do that. And there were no birds of paradise there. They didn't have, Chicago was like Beijing in the winter. New York is like, they have their own flowers, nice, but hydrangeas, yeah. but not Bird of Paradise. And furthermore, when I painted this painting, my mother had just passed away. And my friends from San Francisco sent me a flower arrangement that was so gorgeous. And it had this big bird of paradise and then these other, like, it was a really beautiful, so I drew it. I made like 5 drawings of it. I mean, it was spectacular. And so that made its way into the painting, and it's literally from the arrangement. And it was a problem to put this in the painting because those leaf forms are heavy. And so I had to split the leaf between, to get it to go behind the leaf. So it's you know what I'm saying? That was a really awkward sentence, but it's visual. It's hard to put it into words. So to put it in the background, I had to split it. And so it has all of that richness to it, all of those layers. And that there was something in your question that I haven't answered, but yeah.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask you more about ecology or eco concerns, if you like, within your work. You once said that anthropogenic landscape is beautiful. And by anthropogenic, I'm referring to environmental change caused or influenced by people, either directly or indirectly. And I'm asking about this just given the timing and the context, I guess, of the moment, but also where we are and what, we all went through recently with Helene and Milton. How do you situate your practice within, the increasingly precarious ecosystem that we all find ourselves in? Is interconnectedness of all living being something you spend time reflecting upon? I'm asking this because obviously your work deals so much, if not all of it, with nature, and I'd love for you to share some of this perspective with us today.
This is an uneasy question because I work with plastic. So I
did not mean to put you on the spot.
So it's uneasy in an important way, reflecting the change that we've experienced. But I'm not sure I'm fully supporting, all aboard eco health in my use of materials. I think that when I say that the anthropogenic landscape is beautiful, I do love artifice. I love club culture. I love fakery and the urban landscape. So I choose my materials accordingly, and those big pores that are at CAM really are extending that into another level. But I also belong to organizations that are environmentally conscious. So there's hard conversations, and a lot of artists in those organizations who are working very rigorously with materials that support the environment.
So I put you on the spot, and now I'm going to defend you by saying that your work, the very core of your work and the images within it, I think that's how you bring attention to what is happening. It is, to me, a visual constant reminder in terms of, is this going to last and for how long? Within your practice, are you creating, unfortunately, these relics of time or in time, that one day will serve as memories for us, for generations to come, especially. So those are some things that I was kind of getting at more so than necessarily the materials that you use, because in that case, we're all in some way hypocrites. Museums are in general, I think, on an individual basis, but we all do what we can. But I think especially you as an artist fulfill that role beautifully because your work deals with the environment or the natural environment so much. Each piece to me is almost like a capsule or an homage to something very site-specific that we share and contribute to and have an effect on. So,
I mean, what you're saying, thanks. Not thanks like, oh, thanks. I appreciate that dimension to it because we are all interconnectedness. We're all in this situation, scroll painting. We all move through a lot of virtual and real spaces every day. How do we get from one place to another? How do we live in this? We're all in this room, but 3 weeks ago, we were cowering in our homes or, as Milton rained down upon us. We're living in this schizophrenic nature. And that is just the reality that I paint.
I want to change the subject a little bit and ask you about the Chinese brush painting technique. I've also heard you say once that, first of all, your practice is so much rooted in it, right? In Chinese painting. I love the examples you pulled out and shared with us today. But I've heard this anecdote that you've shared once, and you started telling us today how you took classes at the China Institute in Lower Manhattan. But I don't think you shared today that you took the same class several times, 3 times or 4 times, in order to kind of like master it, if you like. So I absolutely appreciate your dedication to this form of art. And I was hoping that you could expand a little bit more about how the 5th century Tang Dynasty, for instance, painting tradition, the important role it has in your practice today.
So there's the aesthetics of it that are just so beautiful, and with such an economy of means, can create a vibrant and construct a world. The actual practice is very difficult. Well, no, not to overdo it. It is like a sport, and it is also like a meditation. To make one line, first of all, there's a way to hold the brush, and to make one line, you pull back, you push forward, you close it by pulling back. That's one line. To practice that can take an hour for if you're just beginning with it. There's ink load and brush pressure. The coordination of those is not always easy. So technically it is like a sport and a meditation, and it is informative to a lightness of touch and a conception of form that I wouldn't know without it. The Tang Dynasty, the landscape tradition comes out of that period of time, and the painters who the officials who pass the exams and know how to write and become literati painters, literally, because they know how to write, and landscape is wrested from letters. My interest in its inspiration on my work, though, is also very metaphorical. So because it comes out of calligraphy, because there are stroke orders even to each line, and configurations such as the fishtail in bamboo, for example. So this kind of landscape of swappable parts, I would say, is the most valuable aspect of Chinese painting in my work, because swappable parts means that you can invent a landscape. It means that landscape isn't outside of you, but it's in you. And so interconnectedness, it's like pure ingestion. It's in you, and you can invent it, and because you can paint it.
I absolutely appreciate how many different art historical genres you intermix within your work as well. Truly, you're an art historian within your own work. So it's not only the Chinese painting tradition, but it's also, the way you pull the colors, the pouring of the colors, the creating of the compositions, the looking back at some of the abstract expressionists. I was hoping you could also talk about how abstract expressionism, the New York scene of the 50s and 60s, and some of the artists prevalent within it, from like someone like Helen Frankenthaler, for instance, to Sonia Gektoff, to other women artists, have influenced your work. If you could talk to that, but also bring in, and so sorry, this is such a long-winded question, but bring in for instance, the Art Deco, not the Art Deco, but the arts pattern and decoration movement into it as well. Because again, it feels like looking just at one work, one can kind of see all these different movements kind of creeping in and into one another and having this beautiful dance within each of the works. So if you could talk about the influences in general.
So thank you. I love that question. And I think that I don't know when the splashed ink method of painting came in Chinese painting, but that is like a precursor. Of course, the Chinese painters got there first on almost everything. I mean, not that we're competing for territory, but just the prescience with which they conceived of painting was total. And so I can't exist in New York without dealing with abstract expressionism, because it's more or less a religion in the city. And if you don't adhere to that religion, you're excommunicated. I mean, it is literally within the very pavement of the city. Like, oh, I happen to be on 10th Street. Oh, like the place is just riddled with United States expansion internationally through the means of abstract expressionism. And then, of course, there's the legacy of Jackson Pollock, who would come closest to my dream painter, but that legacy is so well molded by the brilliance of Lee Krasner, who turns out to be such a genius painter in her own right. And talk about swappable parts. So within the very cobblestones of New York streets, we have abstract expressionism radiating like sweat from the ground. And Helen Frankenthaler enters with her cohort in the Greenbergian years, after this first sweaty male decade of, de Kooning and Pollock squaring off. And Frankenthaler, I think, I'm going to be a little crude, but I think that Joan Mitchell called her co-text painter. But Frankenthaler made it look easy. And I just printed with someone who printed with her at Tyler Graphics, who said, Frankenthaler worked like 4 hours a day. And so she was very clear. And I think about her intentions in painting, to keep it open and light. And having experimented with those techniques myself, because I'm a huge fan of Frankenthaler, I didn't realize you do have to help yourself stay away from your own painting. If you get a result and you feel like continuing to work, you're taking a 50% chance you're going to destroy your painting. I know, because I've destroyed so many. Because sometimes there's a moment and it's just perfect. And that's the beauty of Frankenthaler, her restraint in letting that be. So, and also her immersive space that's just coming out of this effective translucent color is so inspiring. But my time period, I went to university pretty early. Before I went to Otis Parsons, I went to UC San Diego and UCLA. And in that time period, UC San Diego was extremely conceptual. So there was a theoretical rigor that I've just treasured to this day. But it wasn't hands-on in terms of foundation level courses. So I went to UCLA and avoided them there too. But at UCLA, it was there were a lot of graduate students and advanced undergrads working with pattern and decoration. A lot of boys, like the boys would work with pattern and decoration and then say, I'm a dude and I'm doing this. And the girls would be like, what do we think? And that kind of discussion, I thought it was all cornball until recently, until maybe 10 years ago when I got back from Shanghai and started looking at my mother's decor. Then I started singing a different tune about it and started to look for forebears. And of course, a lot of people I know in New York were part of that movement. And their achievements now, they're maybe a decade or two ahead of me, but their achievements now in pattern and decoration, since the show at Bard that went to LA, I went to both of those shows. Like that's. Sorry, I'm getting anecdotal. It's an important movement because feminism is raging, and it's a language. It's a feminine language. And that's always been important to me, and I've always insisted on it. And people have said, wow, your Chinese landscapes are kind of corny. But, in Shanghai, and this is how I'll wrap up the answer, in Shanghai, I saw the advantage of harmony. I saw how you go to a restaurant, they have like really corny Chinese, like Urzu play, I mean, just the music is playing and it's meant to calm you down, and you really need it. That's the thing. It's a city of 25 million people. You need to be chill. And I think that that's something that I started to value instead of scorn. And so extending that into pattern and decoration, what once was like women's art or dismissible or like too moderate, is now kind of giant because it's a language by women, for women. And yes, men are a part of it too. And who can't say, I mean, we're all the same in the end. It's not like gender is, definable. So China really gave me pattern and decoration.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I've heard people talk about or write about your work as feminist, very much so. And I'm continuing with what you probably just want to finish talking about, but it very much so is a descriptor that certain writers or other curators use when it comes to your work: feminism, feminist art. Another term that I've heard also is rebellious and rebellion. And I think I've shared with you recently that I think of your work as quietly rebellious. I mean, we can see the creeping in of the feminist approach into it because, of course, of the subject matter, the wallpaper references, the lattice work, the opulence, the decadence of it, which I guess would be associated with the feminist art movement. But I wanted to ask you about this rebellion thing that I've heard others describe your work. Is it a reaction or a response to something, to your previous environment or your upbringing, the religious upbringing or your mother's house? Not to get too psychoanalytical about it, but I think it is all connected within your work. Could you speak to that a little bit?
When it comes to rebellion, I'm always happy to talk. So I grew up in a Christian Science family, and my mother was extremely into it. And in the early days, I would say this was a context of the time, too. It was very conformist. We were I was born in 1959, so, the 60s were, on one hand, you had the 60s, which was super exciting, but on the other hand, you had my family, which is super religious. So it was like, you're not going out, or the Beatles are on Sunset Strip. Dad, will you take us? And Mom would say, no, like rock and roll was bad. So, and then the house. You've seen examples of wallpaper in the house, so I think I don't have to tell you what the house looked like. Every room was wildly patterned. Something now that I see as rebellious in itself, but at the time I just saw the wallpaper itself being the dominator, saying to me, your mother's watching you and God is watching you, and you better just stay in your room and keep your hands folded. And if you're listening to rock and roll to whatever. So there were two things that I did as a child. I would write in the wallpaper, like little messages. And then I had a closet that had white walls. So I would push the clothes back and I would draw David Bowie in Latin Sane with the zigzag on his face. I would draw that in my closet, and, write things and have a secret world in there. I'm so rebellious, though, that I rebel against myself. And that's where the changing of motif comes in. Like, if I'm not 100% interested, I'll just change the channel, change the album, change the song. So all of those things, all of it goes in.
Thank you. I'm just being mindful of the time. I'm wondering if there are any burning questions for Elisabeth from our audience at this time.
I noticed you have a lattice.
I noticed you have a lattice motif through. How did that originally start with you? And going back way before the pandemic, was it deliberate, or was it something that evolved as you started just drawing something on a paper or canvas?
It evolved from my mom's pattern. And I don't think I can go through, because I think it kicks me out when I get to the end of the slide talk. But there was a image, the second image on the talk, there's a lattice pattern that my mom had that was like a base for a plant pattern she put over it. And that lattice, when I started painting wallpaper after I got back from Shanghai, it was just a matter of time before that lattice was going to enter in. And it became like in 2019, before the pandemic, it started to become a background and a conceit as an atmosphere that the poured flowers could live in. So it would hold up the pores. I can rebel, but I'm not going to rebel so much. Like I'm going to pour out that flower, but then I'm going to put a lattice to contain it in the space. And so the lattice became like a hand-drawn element. And then during the pandemic, it became a societal structure. It became something like because when the pandemic started, I was in New York, and oh boy, that was scary. And it was, and my apartment was small, and I would make these lattice drawings and print them out. And I had this whole little routine to get through the day. It's really kind of lame. But anyway, so the lattice took on this importance as a societal structure, and then and as a prop. So it's become really important as a way to contain the rebellion.
The banker.
Yeah. Well put. Thanks. Should have asked you.